Hi everybody, welcome to Sunya IAS. Welcome to the mains article discussion. Today we are going to see the IPCC's 6th assessment report in detail from the mains perspective. Now this report is very important. Why? Because it tells us the key findings what are there. It also tells us various aspects related to climate change, and then based on those aspects we get to understand that what should be the policies, how should the countries tackle the threat of climate change. So these are all the things which we are going to see in good detail. Now we know that this is the 6th assessment report, which means prior to this there have been 5 other assessment reports. In fact, the 5th assessment report started in 2013 and finally culminated in the year 2014. So the current assessment report which has come out which started in the year 2022 and finally just had the final report, so it has been a lot of time in between. And again, for something as crucial as climate change, where we have to have evidences, that is why a documentation of report is very important. Now the 6th assessment reports highlights a code red for the word. Why a code red? Because the level of carbon dioxide emissions has increased, and secondly, in comparison to the pre-industrial levels, there has been an average warming of 1.1 degrees Celsius. The increase in the average warming is 1.1 degrees Celsius overall since the pre-industrial levels. That is why it highlights or it tells that this is actually a code red. Okay, so we will understand these things, but I'll just quickly go through the history of the report, right? That there have been 5 previous instances of the report, and you would also see that after every report as such there has been higher emissions or higher human induced emissions so far, right? For example, when I talk about the first report which came way back in 1990, and again this IPCC as a body was formed in the year 1988, okay, by the combined efforts of WMO, World Meteorological Organization, and UNEP. And since then there have been assessment reports which have come out. Now, for example, the first report basically highlighted that in the last 100 years there has been a 0.3 to 0.6 degrees Celsius increase. Now in the comparative perspective, this 0.3 to 0.6 has increased to 1.1 degrees Celsius. So in terms of global warming, in the last odd years we have seen that there has been a huge increase in the average temperatures. Okay, then the first report also said that the sea level is likely to rise by 65 centimeters by 2100. In fact, if you see this year's mains paper, directly a question which quoted IPCC and related to sea level rise, this was even higher. It is 65. This was way back in the first report, but the recent estimates say that it has surpassed even 100 centimeters as a sea level rise, right? So that is one aspect or one finding of the report. That is why the report we have to see in some detail, right? So that we are able to understand all the major implications. So these are few of the main, let's say, findings of the report. After 1990, the next report came out in 1995. By then, the Rio Earth Summit had, let's say, come out. Again, it had revised its projections, just highlighting, for example, that there can be an overall 3-degree increase in the temperatures, etc. So again, and sea level rise will be around 50 centimeters. So 2 main parameters is what we are seeing so far. Okay, then we move to the third report of 2001, and by then the Kyoto Protocol of 1997 also had been set up. Okay, so again there were slightly more detailing, as you can see. So there were more revised temperature predictions which was spoken about. It again spoke about sea level rise now from 65 to around 50 to 80 centimeters was the increase that we had seen, right? Then every time when the report comes out, it tells that the frequency and the intensity of the extreme weather events is going to increase, which we are seeing. For example, there have been more droughts, or in fact more severe droughts. If I talk about cyclones, if we talk about melting or retreat of glaciers, so the extreme weather events have increased, and again the third report also highlighted about that. Okay, and from now you will see that every report will basically say that all these changes are attributable to humans. These are human induced changes. Okay, so this is also one of the strong evidences that this activity, ये जो activity है, this is because of ये human actions की वजह से हो रही है. That is the main component which has been highlighted by this particular report. Now, in 2007 we had the fourth report, right? The fourth report basically telling कि greenhouse gas emissions increased by 70% in the time from 1970 to 2004. ये भी यही highlight कर रहा है that this is caused by the human activities, that this is attributable to the human activities. Fine. अब please focus on this fact. Atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, CO2, was 379 ppm, which was highest in the 6,50,000 years. This is 379 ppm in 2005. If you compare it with 2023, this has already surpassed 415 ppm. One more evidence of human induced climate change. Okay, up the fourth report was very landmark in the year 2007. Why? Because it actually won a Nobel Peace Prize, right? And again, it again spoke about the sea level rise, it again spoke about the warming or the likely increase in temperature. तो वो चीजें almost consistent हैं, but just the severity increased that we had seen. Okay, and again आप बार बार देख रहे हैं कि every time the report comes out, it actually forms a basis for one of the upcoming UNFCCC summits. So for example, the 2007 report became a basis for the 2009 Copenhagen climate meet. Okay, so this is how the report has progressed. That is something we have to understand. And then you had the fifth report of 2014, and after that we have the sixth report, which we will now see in more detail. Okay, अब fifth report में भी, for example, it spoke कि pre-industrial time से the temperature rise can be very steep, as high as 4.8 degrees Celsius. And these temperatures, I'll just tell you when I discuss the sixth assessment report, that what is the significance of these numbers: 1.1 degrees Celsius, 1.5 degrees Celsius, etc. Right? Up CO2, methane and nitrous oxides, the concentrations of this is increasing at a very alarming level. Okay, then more frequent and longer heat waves. This was spoken way back in 2014. If you look at the heat waves currently, for example, if I give you example of Australian bushfires in Spain, even the heat waves in northern part of India and parts of South Asia, you will notice that there has been considerable increase. So they are more frequent and they are even longer in duration. So that has been a consistent thing which has happened throughout these years. Okay, then large fraction of species face the threat of extinction. This was spoken again in the fifth assessment report, right? And as we have seen, as the reports have come out, as the temperatures have increased, there have been more frequent extinctions. This has been the case. Okay, and this report formed the basis of the Paris Agreement of 2015. Okay, so Paris Agreement जो है 2015 का, which is again a very landmark agreement. क्यों? Because it spoke about limiting the rise of this warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is why in every major update, in fact, recently the COP28 got concluded, and even in that, multiple times the Paris Agreement's, let's say, target of 1.5 degrees Celsius is being referred to again and again. This was just the history of the report. Now let us go back into some of the structure of this IPCC report, and after this I will tell you the main findings of the 6th assessment report, which you can directly quote in your mains answers, right? So this will give you a lot of weightage, and this is not just limited only to environment, be it case of economics. In economics, if you think of agriculture, if you think of energy, सारी जगहों पे आप इस रिपोर्ट को यूज कर सकते हो to highlight and substantiate what is the basic requirement here, right? So for example, throughout these reports, the mandate of the IPCC has been to study the impacts, to study climate change, to study the impacts of climate change, and ultimately help in mitigating climate change. Okay, so they have every year and year they have gone through a lot of such reports. Okay, and similarly there has been a structure of the report. For example, there are different working groups which are created. For example, there is a working group 1, there is a working group 2, and then there is a working group 3. For example, the working group 1 only talks about the physical science associated with the aspects of climate change. The working group 2 talks about the impacts related to climate change, and working group 3 deals with mitigation of climate change. So to carry out the proper assessment, there are working groups which are created, and then that is how a very comprehensive set of findings are, let's say, collated in one place and then shared with the world. Okay, with the whole idea that if we have proper, let's say, working groups and assessments, then we can make long-term policies. Okay, that is the whole idea behind all of this. Okay, after this I will also tell you the major findings in the next slide of the report, but the most important finding for us will be that carbon dioxide level or carbon dioxide emissions have increased. This is beyond 400 ppm parts per million. And second, the average warming or the average increase in the after the pre-industrial levels is 1.1 degrees Celsius, which is why it is being said as the code red for our climate system. Code red for our climate system because of two major things. Again, we'll focus on this. So these are few of the important aspects related to this. Okay, and then there is a final assessment cycle. So for example, if the, let's say, the report, let's say the 6th assessment report has to be carried out, there are different assessment cycles within that, and it approximately takes a span of entire 1 year. Okay, there are different working groups, and then after that there is a synthesis report as well. So in the final assessment cycle overall, okay, so in the final assessment cycle, it has given us proper periodical assessment. Okay, and based on that you have a whole list of findings that I'll now tell you. Okay, so through this proper mechanism you get a huge list of findings which the governments, the civil society organizations, NGOs, and different, let's say, policy think tanks can use, and that can be for the benefit of all. Okay, so one by one we will see that again what are the important key findings of the report. The first, of course, being that the rate of global warming is increasing. Right now we have discussed that compared to the pre-industrial levels there is a 1.1 degree Celsius increase, and we already know for us the limit as per the Paris Agreement was 1.5, but the report says that if we go by the current levels, okay, because right now we are in 2023, the target is to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. But are we on track? No. And the report even says that we might even surpass 3 degrees Celsius if we go by this speed. Okay, so we have to also understand that the level of global warming currently is very rapid. Okay, there are severe climate impacts, and whenever you have to write points like this, always think in terms of examples. think of the world map. Now think that because of climate change, what all is happening. So for example, again, I told you, if you think of wildfires, heat waves, think of Australian bushfires from the year 2019 to 2020. Okay. Second, if you think of the coast of India, the Indian coast has seen both increase, so that means higher frequency and more intensity of tropical cyclones. Okay, so think of the city, or let's say the states like Odisha, which are very much prone to a lot of these floods or to the cyclones, etc. Think of countries like Maldives and other low-lying islands. Now, because of increased climate change, think of melting of glaciers, higher rise in the sea level. If the sea level is rising, all these countries will drown and ultimately submerge. That will trigger the displacement of people, right? So, the moment you think about, so there are multiple severe climate impacts on different geographies of the world. Again, think about ocean acidification. Think of the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. Okay, the level of ocean acidification has substantially increased over a set of years. So that again is a problem. Okay, so there are, yes, severe climate impacts that one has seen so far. And again, the report highlights that there is a need for adequate adaptation measures. Now, this is where the report also is not just talking about the technology aspect. The report also says that to be able to do adaptation, what do you ultimately need? Money. So basically, the report says that one has to go for 43% reduction in the emissions by the year 2050. And if you want to reduce your level of emissions, you have to, one, go for technology upgrade. What does this need? It needs money. So both the developed as well as the developing, in fact, the developing countries need more assistance. Okay. So there is a need for adequate adaptation measures. That is something has to be very clear in our head. Yes, that there is a need for adequate adaptation measures. Okay. And this would need subsequent mobilization of funds, money and resources with the due passage of time. That is why when the COP28 etc. concludes or happens, most of the articles revolve around this part only, that ultimately how is adaptation and mitigation going to be, right? So you need proper collaboration in terms of manpower, in terms of technology, and ultimately in terms of money and finance. Okay, so that is an important thing again highlighted by the report. Okay, global temperature projections. Okay, so again here, this basically the report highlights that the 1.5 degrees Celsius which we want to limit to will easily be surpassed by the year 2100, and not by 2100, even before 2050. That is why all these things make a lot of sense, that you have to invest more or in reduction of your emissions. Lesser uses of fossil fuel should be the way forward. It ultimately talks about phasing down fossil fuels, transitioning to a low carbon economy. But you will understand these things only when you understand the key findings. That is why after this we discuss the solutions. Okay, so global temperature projections are increasing, which will make it very, very difficult as time goes. Okay, similarly, if I talk of the context of India, in India as well, again, while we have very ambitious targets, if you see India's Panchamrit, okay, so in India, if you basically, again, if you see the geography of India also, India is also very much prone, in fact is very much prone to climate disasters, right? And secondly, the capacity of different states are different. Not every state can have a very, let's say, good early warning systems. Similarly, the resilience of the people, the resilience of the infrastructure is also a function of how much money you have put in, how much resource the country would have overall. So there also the case for India, it is highlighted that yes, there is a lot of need, especially in case of India. And again, I'll give you multiple examples. For example, the Himalayan glacier is retreating. Now, Himalayan glacier is feeding both India as well as Bangladesh, which are very much dependent. Okay. Now, if climate change is not, let's say, kept in control, so this very important source of water after a few years will be very much fluctuating. Second, India is very much dependent on monsoons, which is mean that one, you're dependent on monsoon, and second, your agriculture output is also then dependent on monsoons. So if there is, let's say, prolonged El Nino, or if there are more prolonged floods, whatever happens, so both the incomes of the farmers, secondly the agriculture output, and ultimately the food security of the country will also be at, let's say, threat. And I'm not even yet included the increased warming of Bay of Bengal as well as the Arabian Sea, which can then trigger even more extreme weather events. So all these things will highlight that the case of India is also very much important to take into account. Okay. Then moving on, the current status of climate change. So yes, the report basically again talks about that overall, if you compare with the 1850s, 1900 to the present times, there has been a 1.1 degree Celsius increase in the temperatures. Okay. And the atmospheric concentrations of CO2 have surpassed 415 ppm. These are the two major findings you want to maybe remember. Other than that, it also talks about the increasing level of sea level rise. Okay. This is going to surpass 1 meter. Okay. So that is 100 centimeters will be the, let's say, the increase in sea level. Okay. And based on this gives you future climate projections. So future climate projections, I will club it with the Paris Agreement. Okay. Paris Agreement again spoke about this 1.5 degree to be limited till the year 2100. But again, the future climate projections as per IPCC, it simply says that this is going to exceed this by a huge margin. Okay. And why is that? Because the greenhouse gas emissions are increasing overall. There is a code red which has been highlighted here. Okay. So the future climate change projections will be that there will be even more frequent extreme weather events. Okay. And it will be difficult to meet the targets of Paris Agreement until and unless we invest a lot and we go for very strong emission cuts. Okay, so this again is something very important for us to know and take note of. Okay, so this is something, because ultimately the target is, while it is 1.5, the report says that based on the current level of projections, we will ultimately hit 3 degrees Celsius by 2100, which is almost the double of your target. So you can imagine the severity of this whole particular problem. Okay. And again, it highlights the carbon budget considerations. Again, for every level of emissions that one has to go through, be it a developed or a developing country, it requires money. And ultimately, the report says that you have to transition to a low carbon economy. Now, a low carbon economy will of course require again subsequent investments. Okay. So the whole idea is that if you want to limit everything to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the carbon budget for that is far lesser than if you go for limiting it to 2 degrees Celsius, which means that development will come at a cost. And if we are able to limit our rise to only 1.5, this will take very less money compared to 2 degrees Celsius or the kind of projections which we are now in. So the whole idea is again to highlight that we must be adapting ourselves, cutting down the emissions. That is why the report highlights all these findings to present a very strong case, okay, for the governments and the people to ultimately make some changes. So first of all, these are the important key findings from the report. Now I will tell you what are the implications of the report on India. Now I will present to you in a very, let's say, diagrammatical format, but still we should be able to brainstorm some of the important points. Again, imagine the case of India, okay? And by the way, the question can again be that what is the implication of the report on the world? So whatever you are learning for India, maybe you can add a couple of more points and you can tailor make it for the world as well. Okay, so for example, we can talk about forest fires, we can talk about ocean acidification, okay, we can talk about glacier retreat, and because of that we can talk about sea level rise, we can talk about floods, droughts, so on and so forth. So the point is, implications, you can think a lot of points. And again, whenever you think of implications, also think about the social dimension of anything, because most of us will be thinking of the environmental dimension, that yes, this will lead to, let's say, destruction of coral reefs, okay? But what about the people? What about the livelihoods of the people? And what about the internal migration, or maybe some climate refugees also, okay? So do not neglect the social aspect, because this is also very important in this particular regard, okay? So now let us see some important implications of the report. So number one, we know that yes, this will trigger extreme weather events in terms of droughts, in terms of floods, in terms of, let's say, tropical cyclones, okay? So now whenever we write a point, let us make a habit to substantiate that point with a recent example, okay? We have been reading about a lot of these examples. So the moment you mention extreme weather events, maybe you can just quickly mention the recent droughts, or let's say the recent cyclones, etc., and maybe just give the name of the cyclone and the area, okay? Because this is with respect to India, so more examples are appreciated. Now again, a social point: prioritize the vulnerable population. Why? And this is where climate change and disaster management are interlinked. How can you manage a disaster better? Let's say you invest a lot of money on the infrastructure, but then what about the population? That is why one has to prioritize the vulnerable population, because they have the least capacity to deal with these changes. And within the vulnerable population, think about the women, older people, think about children. So we have to prioritize the vulnerable population, because in the event of extreme weather events, okay, climate catastrophes, availability of food, availability of safe infrastructure will all be not possible, okay? So that is why one has to prioritize vulnerable population. You can give example of, let's say, the coastal states of India, or the states, let's say like Himachal, or the regions which are very much prone to forest fires, right? Or let's say the portions which are very much prone to droughts or floods, right? There is a threat or a loss of biodiversity. We can give example of Western Ghats, okay, because again it faces a lot of extreme stress because of climate change. So while it is a biodiversity hotspot, but it is still losing biodiversity, something that one has to, let's say, keep in mind. Monsoon changes, right? Again, a country which is dependent a lot on monsoon, okay, and that is why we are also dependent on the vagaries or the fluctuations of the monsoons. So these monsoonal changes will impact our agriculture productivity, the income of the farmers, and ultimately the food security. Coastal flooding, right? In fact, on coastal flooding, again in 2022 a question had come. Now coastal flooding is again a topic in itself, that this can be caused both due to the natural factors but also man-made factors. But now with climate change, what would happen? More flooding of this sort. So the coasts will face more abrasive activity from the water. So coastal flooding will again be a problem of sort, right? So this again is something that one has to keep in mind, that coastal flooding can be a problem, okay? And then you can mention the livelihood of the fishermen or the communities dependent here, right? Global mean sea level rise in the Indian Ocean. Now, link this with the geography. Indian Ocean, okay, has been supporting, let's say, the blue economy, which means when I talk about the aquaculture, when I talk about sustainable fishing, and again the movement, navigation of ships, everything. So what would happen if ultimately, and again there are a lot of countries which are present here, a lot of small island nation states. So if the global mean level is increasing, what will ultimately happen? Number one, that all these small island nation states will be under stress. When they come under stress, so there will be again, let's say, movement of the people outside. Similarly, all the coastal related activities would again be at halt. Okay, so these activities perhaps would have to be stopped because of this whole part here, right? So again, this will be a threat for India and again for its neighbors and in the entire ecosystem. So both from security sense, from disaster management sense, if there is anything which is happening which is going to be a problem here, right? Himalayan glacier retreat, we had already discussed this part again, because Himalayan glaciers is feeding a lot of our perennial rivers, and when the glacier ultimately starts to melt and retreat, after a period of time, this will fundamentally change the availability of resources in the region. Okay, so this also would be a problem. Intensification of heat waves, this we have seen, and in fact since the last 2 or 3 years, especially in the northern belt, the intensification, so it means the frequency of these heat waves and also the length and the duration of the heat waves has certainly increased. Okay, so the intensification of heat waves is something we are seeing. Impact on the agriculture, so the point, this agriculture impact, the point related to monsoon changes can be again interlinked. Okay, that ultimately this will lead to changes in the agriculture output or the agricultural yield, so that will also be a problem. Okay, so these are the implications of the report on India. We have had discussed around 7 or 8 points. You can even add a couple of more points if you want. Okay, but again, all these points are ensuring that the mains coverage is very holistic in nature. Okay, so these are, let's say, the implications of the report here. Okay, again, before I move to the recommendations, again, because this is specific to India, for example, the question was on the word. I can even add desertification. Now desertification can also be added here as well. For example, if I talk about the sub-Saharan regions, they are very much prone to desertification, and again, let's say the region of Rajasthan, parts of, let's say, Kathiawar, Gir region, again very much prone to desertification within India as well. So even this point can be there, and again desertification can be linked to agricultural impact. Okay, so this will go in tune. Again, if I talk about, let's say, the parts of world, okay, so there also, if there are changes in the ocean currents as well, okay, so this again will trigger different atmospheric phenomena. Okay, again El Nino, La Nina, those aspects I have not mentioned specifically, but again this will also change the distribution of resources throughout. Okay, so that one more example that you can definitely give here, right? Other than that, if you want to give, I have not mentioned specifically here, but I can even write about ocean acidification, which is happening throughout, and related to this will be the destruction of coral reefs. You can give example of Great Barrier Reef of Australia, which has seen a lot of destruction in the recent past, right? So again, depending on whether the question is on India or on the world, you can give even more examples. Again, you can also talk about Amazon rainforest. Okay, how the forest fires in Amazon rainforests are directly responsible for the loss of biodiversity. So this is how you can link these elements. For India also, you can give example of forest fires either in the coniferous, let's say, forests, etc., or other regions which are responsible for the loss of biodiversity. Okay, so these are few of the things you can definitely link here. And again, one more part here, again, which will be a social part, that availability of food, number one, and ultimately the demographic changes which happen, because ultimately the people who have resources will move to better, let's say, parts of the world. But what about the people who are stuck in those regions, right? So that is why the implications of these reports are very important. And in UPSC, whenever you get a question, it will not just be only about the key findings of the report. It will always be, what are the key findings, what are the implications, and what can the government do in this regard. Okay, so now let us talk about the recommendations made by IPCC AR6, the synthesis report. What are the let's say recommendations which are being made? Okay, so number one, of course, has to be to pursue the 1.5 degree Celsius goal. Okay, we are at 1.1. It will be very difficult, but we have to ensure that we ultimately hit this goal. This will help us in meeting the carbon budget. Otherwise, we will be overspending a lot. So this is one thing. Second, ambitious emission reduction targets, one of them being 43% reduction by the year 2050. Okay, and around 60-65% reduction by the year 2070. Because the level of rise is so high, that is why you need ambitious reduction targets. And this requires efforts at a collective level. It cannot be only efforts of one or two countries, because again, environment as a collective good has to be protected. This is very important point, responsibility of developed. Again, when you read about the politics of climate change and the politics of environment, there is again a constant, let's say, battle between the developed and the developing countries. The developed countries are now accusing the developing countries of pursuing development, whereas they have been one of the biggest emitters, not just in a very short span, but for a huge span of time. But they are historically evading responsibilities, which is why most of the agreements, be it COP25, 26, 27, 28, all of that is not ultimately being able to get a very concrete step. Why? Because the responsibility part is missing. At least in the COP27, there was a talk about setting up of a loss and damage fund. But again, how to operationalize it, how much responsibility are they going to take, still will take some time to materialize. But still, at the international negotiations table, this is one point you have to always highlight, that the responsibility of the developed countries is far higher and they must act accordingly. Okay, then updating the climate action plans. Now, many countries who had submitted their action plans for COP21 is Paris Agreement. This was way back in 2015. Many countries have not updated their action plans. India has updated it. You would have seen the India's Panchamrit, but again, many countries have not, which basically means from 2015 to now 2023 is also going to be over. There has been a huge change both in the emission intensity and also in the levels of development. So again, this requires proper updation of the climate action plans. Okay, again, very important thing is to phase out coal. Right now, we started our lecture talking about the increase in carbon dioxide levels, increase in warming. Why was that happening? It was because of burning of fossil fuels. And in fact, the nature of now pursuing climate demands that we phase out coal, okay, as soon as possible. While it is also true that there is a huge dependence on coal, okay, and again, it's a cheap alternative, etc. So actually phasing out coal will now take some time. Okay, but during that time, we should have alternate technologies, alternate resources available, so that this phasing out can be done in a smoother manner. Okay, this is also one of very important part of the debate on climate change, that how fast can we phase out coal. And in doing this, we want to have active discussions, collaborations with the countries, etc., so that everybody comes to the proper drawing board. Okay, because this would require certain level of collaboration between the countries as well. right? Moving on, scaling up renewable energy. Now I'll give you example of Denmark. Denmark has transitioned to a low carbon economy, and again it is doing fairly well in achieving the targets and reducing its level of emissions. This is ultimately the way to go. In fact, India also is very ambitious. We want to achieve around 50% of our energy through renewable by the year 2030. So here also this is something which is going to be very important, right? That how we are going to be able to achieve this part, right? That you have to scale up the renewable energy, and simply scaling up will not be important. What is also important is to make it more affordable. As the time has gone, we have seen that the solar energy is now becoming more affordable. That should be the way forward. That is why we have to scale up the renewable energy as much as possible. Okay. And the last point here, harnessing indigenous knowledge. Now, especially on indigenous knowledge and biodiversity framework, I have again taken a mains article discussion. I've given you a lot of points. And why is this important if we talk about the indigenous knowledge? Because to be able to tackle the current conflicts, let's say, be it wildfires, okay, or be it other problems, indigenous solutions, be of, let's say, the different tribal groups, are also very much important, because this indigenous knowledge actually conserves biodiversity, has nature at its core. So these are NBS, nature based solutions. So you are conserving biodiversity, these are nature based solutions, and ultimately it is not going to increase the carbon dioxide, etc. That is why harnessing indigenous knowledge is very, very, very important in tackling the cause of climate change, because this does away with deforestation. Okay, you can give example of, let's say, the Peruvian tribes from India, or tribes from different parts of the world. Ultimately the whole thing is that they talk about how to integrate nature into all these considerations. Okay, so these are some of the recommendations. And the last point which I will tell you, if you think about all these points, renewable energy, phasing out coal, ambitious targets, goal, etc., so you might think that everything here is about technology. While technology, true, is one part, but two more things are very important when I'm talking about climate change. One is the social aspect of it, and second is the economic aspect of it. So not just technology, that yes, technology is very much important, true. That transition to renewable, phasing out coal requires investment in technology, but at the same time integrate society, social considerations. That is why indigenous knowledge is very important. That is why we must take into account what is the impact on the different vulnerable populations. And economics part, why? Because adaptation, mitigation requires money, so we have to take that into account. Then one is the money part, and second is the developed versus developing debate. This is also very, very important in this particular manner. So one, when we are going to see this in this whole particular format, then we will be able to ultimately take IPCC's report in the best possible manner. And one last point here is that implications we know, recommendations we know, but now we have to integrate it into the policy. Okay, so long term policies of the government. Second, for education and awareness, the reports should be used, right? That is why if it is becoming a part of country's legislations, excellent. If not legislations, ultimately it should be a part of the policy of the think tanks, so that the government, corporate entities, everybody is in tune ultimately in achieving the targets and phasing out coal, transitioning to a renewable energy. And the last part will be the educative and the awareness part, that the common people should also be made aware about the key findings, highlights, implications of the report. Okay, So with that, we come to an end of this mains article discussion. If you want, you can, for the notes, you can join our Telegram channel, telegram.me Sunya Notes 50. Okay, and we are again and again meeting you on a daily basis with this mains article discussion. I'll meet you then shortly. Thank you.